Welcome to the New York Symposium with Diane Sayre. I'm Diane Sayre, and I am an independent LaRouche candidate for U.S. Senate now in 2024, the seat currently occupied by Senator Kirsten Gillibrand. What we're going to be looking at tonight is a conference that was held on November 22nd, the 59th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And what I wanted to do was to review a few of the presentations. This was a conference in two panels. It was very intense. I have to say that I was really completely blown away by what I heard. Let me just show you to give you a sense of what happened there. So here is the program. You can see Helga Zepp-LaRouche, founder of the Schiller Institute, gave the keynote, then followed by an actual sitting congressman in Mexico, Congressman Benjamin Robles Montoya, Senator retired Colonel Richard Black from Virginia, Stephen Starr, who is an expert on what happens in a nuclear war, Karl Krökel, who is the founder of Craftsmen for Peace, a leader of German craftsmen. So you have a number of speakers from Germany. People may be aware that the German town of Stralsund has actually offered, as has Congressman Gosar in Arizona, to be a site for peace negotiations. And now that's been joined by a number of French mayors, one of whom here, Patrice Kint, was part of the discussion. Scott Ritter, people know very well, former Marine intelligence officer, former UN weapons inspector, and then speakers from Italy, Argentina, etc. The thing that was very striking to me is that I learned a great deal from each of the presenters. This was not old material. This is what people had to say was new, and also the fact that you have actual legislators or former legislators from all over the world who have a much more reasonable policy than that of the Biden administration or the UK or NATO. Now, just a couple quick updates. Speaking of the UK, Boris Johnson has been made an honorary citizen of Kiev. The mayor Klitschko was someone, if you remember the famous Victoria Nuland tape where she was talking about who was going to be put in power in Ukraine. She rejected him as prime minister for various reasons, but he's a good qualified Nazi supporter, and he now appropriately has made Boris Johnson an honorary citizen of Kiev, perhaps for Johnson's role in sabotaging Zelensky's first attempt to negotiate. We are going into an escalated military situation. It's very urgent that Americans understand that Russia cannot lose. Therefore, if the US, the UK, and NATO insist on pushing Russia to back down, you're going to just have a confrontation, a very ugly confrontation, perhaps a thermonuclear confrontation, not because Russia will initiate it, but because of what the US and our NATO partners are doing. The spokeswoman for the Russian Foreign Ministry, Maria Zakharova, made the point that more and more military experts seem to be coming into Ukraine, including Americans, as people may be aware of. She said that you have a cover for financial fraud, that people are making billions of dollars in the so-called military-industrial complex. People have probably heard a bit on the news of this FTX scandal, which somehow was making millions of dollars, sending millions of dollars to Ukraine, and then funding Democratic Party candidates to the tune of something like $74 million. However, others in FTX also were funding the Republican Party, and that is how these politics work. The problem is that none of this is in reality. None of this is addressing the real crisis or the fact that we actually are careening toward thermonuclear war. So I'm going to stop there because I'd like you to hear what Helga Zepp-LaRouche had to this conference, and please pay particular attention to the 10 points she raises at the end, which really are a solution concept for how we get out of this crisis. So we'll go to Helga.
Well, let me greet you wherever you may be. What has brought people from all over the world together here in this conference is the recognition that humanity is at a crossroad. There is clearly the danger that the present geopolitical confrontation between those forces who want to assert that the Western liberal model of democracy should be the only good and accepted one, and those who insist that the idea of an unipolar world is irrevocably past and has already been replaced by a multipolar world order, could lead to a thermonuclear war. Such a war could be ignited by design or by accident in the short term over the proxy war in Ukraine. Such a crisis could erupt before the end of the year. If the proposals made earlier this year by such people as Malcolm Chalmers, the Deputy General Secretary of the Royal United Service Institute, RUSI, to quote, cook the Russian frog by provoking a Cuban missile crisis on steroids, as he says, over an Ukrainian attempt to reconquer Crimea. Russia could view this as an existential threat and activate its nuclear arsenal on the highest alert and threaten its use, says Sharma. This would be a moment of extreme danger, he says, but because of the extreme imminent danger of such a situation, it would be easier for all parties to find compromises. To propose a policy which aims to drive the strategic conflict to the edge of the extinction of the human race does not even find a comment by the governments of the oh so good governments of the rules-based order. But to argue with the facts that the Russian intervention in Ukraine has a prehistory can in the worst case get you a jail sentence, according to a new law passed by the German parliament on October 20th with a change of Article 130 of the Criminal Code, Paragraph 5. In tune with this British perspective is apparently the Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister, Harilov, who just said in an interview with Sky News, we can step in Crimea by the end of December, and emphasized about the retaking of Crimea. It's only a matter of time. Of course, we would like to make it sooner than later. The British seem to want to excel themselves in creating world wars, as it was Boris Johnson who personally made sure in April that the promise of ending the war through negotiations was sabotaged. Unfortunately, it seems to be the majority of the transatlantic security establishment, many of whom just met at the Halifax International Security Conference, who agree the way to protect global democracy right now is with weapons and support for Ukraine's battle against Russia, not talks, rejecting even the proposal of General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States, that it may now be the time for diplomacy. It is this criminal policy of nuclear brinkmanship which contains the danger of the annihilation of the entire human species in a global nuclear war and following nuclear winter, which is what automatically makes every individual on Earth a world citizen who has to take the responsibility for the outcome of this present conjuncture of human history. We therefore want to catalyze an international movement of world citizens who are committed to propose a new international security and development architecture, which will take into account the interest of every single country on the planet. This concept, to consider the interest of every country, was the principle of the Peace of Westphalia, which laid the basis for peace after 150 years of religious war in Europe and represented the beginning of international law and laid the foundation for the UN Charter, which we need to uphold and reassert. What are the fundamental principles on which such a new global security and development architecture must be built? The absolute center for such a new architecture must be the image of man, about which all nations can agree. Man is differentiated from all other species by his gift of creative reason, that he or she is the only creature that can again and again discover new valid principles of the physical universe, and through the application of the scientific and technological progress in the production process, can increase the quality of life, longevity, and number of human beings living. It is that creative potential which makes human people sacred. The epoch which is coming to an end is the period of the last approximately 600 years, which began with the emergence of the sovereign nation state based on the writings of Nicolas of Cuses and the first sovereign nation state of Louis XI in France in the 15th century, being concerned for the first time with the common good of the people, and the opposition to this idea on the side of the Venetian Empire. For 600 years, there has been a continuous battle between those two forms of government, between the sovereign nation state and the oligarchical form of society, vacillating back and forth, with sometimes a greater emphasis in this or that direction. All empires based on the oligarchical model were oriented towards protecting the privileges of the ruling elite, while trying to keep the masses of the population as backward as possible, because as sheep, they are easier to control. And we hear something about that a little later. It was considered normal to keep a certain portion of the people as slaves or helots, as Schiller describes it in his writing about the laws of Solon and Lycurgus, which can be killed if they get too many. It was the same oligarchical outlook which was the basis of the ideology of Malthus and the underlying assumption of all colonial policies, including in the modern forms of colonialism, of which President Sukarno had warned in his speech at the first Bandung Conference in 1955. It is against this modern-day colonialism, against which there is now a powerful renaissance of the non-aligned movement, which is working on a new economic system involving the BRICS Plus, which more and more countries want to join, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, and other organizations of the Global South. Already during the Roman Empire, Christianity emerged, and for the first time in European civilization came the idea of the sacredness of each human person as in the image of the Creator, being gifted with that creative power, the, quote, vis creativa, as Cusa calls it, which emanates from his or her likeness with the Creator. That same idea is also found in the other two monotheistic religions, Judaism and Islam, as well as secular humanism, Confucianism, or Indian philosophy and religion in the tradition of the Vedic writings, as well as echoes of the idea found in other cultures. Whenever currents emerged in these religions which deviated from the idea that all human beings are sacred, like in the Crusades or the Inquisition, it meant they were instrumentalized by the oligarchical elites for their purposes. The new paradigm, which will be characteristic of the new epoch and towards which the new global security and development architecture must be directed, therefore must eliminate the concept of oligarchism for good and proceed to organize a political order in such a way that the true character of humanity as the creative species can be realized. Therefore, I suggest that the following principles must be discussed and, if agreed upon, be realized. These ideas are meant to be food for thought and a dialogue among all people concerned to find a basis for a world order guaranteeing the durable existence of the human species. First, the new international security and development architecture must be a partnership of perfectly sovereign nation states, which is based on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence and the UN Charter. Second, the absolute priority must be to alleviate poverty in every nation on the planet, which is easily possible if the existing technologies are being used for the benefit of the common good. Third, the life expectancy of all people living must be prolonged to the fullest potential by creating modern health systems in every country on the planet. This is also the only way how the present and future potential pandemics can be overcome or be prevented. Fourth, since mankind is the only creative species known so far in the universe, and given the fact that human creativity is the only source of wealth through the potentially limitless discovery of new universal principles, one of the main aims of the new international security and development architecture must be providing access to universal education for every child and adult person living. The true nature of man is to become a beautiful soul, as Friedrich Schiller discusses this. And the only person who can fulfill that condition is the genius. Fifth, the international financial system must be reorganized so that it can provide productive credits to accomplish these aims. A reference point can be the original Bretton Woods system as Franklin D. Roosevelt intended it, but was never implemented due to his untimely death, and the 4 laws proposed by LaRouche. The primary aim of such a new credit system must be to increase dramatically the living standard of especially the nations of the global south and of the poor in the global north. 6, the new economic order must focus on creating the conditions for modern industries and agriculture, starting with the infrastructural development of all continents to eventually be connected by tunnels and bridges to become a world land bridge. 7th, the new global security architecture must eliminate the concept of geopolitics by ending the division of the world into blocks. The security concerns of every sovereign nation must be taken into account. Nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction must be immediately banned. Through international cooperation, the means must be developed to make nuclear weapons technologically obsolete, as it was originally intended by the proposal which became known as the SDI, suggested by LaRouche and made as an offer to the Soviet Union by President Reagan. 8th, in former times, one civilization at one corner of the world could go under, and the rest of the world would only find out years later due to the length of distances and the time needed for travel. Now, for the first time, because of nuclear weapons, pandemics, the internet, and other global effects, mankind is sitting in one boat. Therefore, a solution to the existential threat to humanity cannot be found with the help of secondary or partial arrangements, but the solution must be found on the level of that higher one, which is more powerful than the many. It requires the thinking on the level of the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites, of Nikolaus of Cusa. Ninth, in order to overcome the conflicts arising out of quarreling opinions, which is how empires have maintained control over the underlings, the economic, social, and political order has to be brought in cohesion with the lawfulness of the physical universe. In European philosophy, this was discussed as being in character with natural law. In Indian philosophy as cosmology, and in other cultures, appropriate notions can be found. Modern sciences like space science, biophysics, or thermonuclear fusion science will increase the knowledge of mankind about this lawfulness continuously. A similar cohesion can be found in the great work of classical art in different cultures. Hence, the basic assumption for the new paradigm is that man is fundamentally good and capable to infinitely perfect the creativity of his mind and the beauty of his soul. And being the most advanced geological force in the universe, which proves that the lawfulness of the mind and that of the physical universe are in correspondence and cohesion, and that all evil is the result of a lack of development and therefore can be overcome. A new world economic order is emerging, involving the vast majority of the countries of the global south. The European nations and the United States must not fight this effort, but by joining hands with the developing countries, cooperate to shape the next epoch of development of the human species to become a renaissance of the highest and most noble expressions of creativity. Let us therefore create an international movement of world citizens who work together to shape the next phase in the evolution of mankind, the new epoch. World citizens of all countries unite.
Great. So that was Helga Zepp-LaRouche's keynote address to this conference, and it's worth listening to several times because she touches on so many, universal principles relating to the question of the dignity of man, the goodness of man, the respect of human creativity in the domain of natural law, and the historical references to this, whether it goes back to the Vedic hymns in India, Confucius in China, Plato and Socrates in so-called Western civilization. This is the basis to establish a new order of relations, as she said, among perfectly sovereign nations, and ending with the conclusion that human beings are fundamentally good, which is true. It's hard to recognize that from the behavior of some of our ruling class, but they're not a good sample. They're a tiny minority and aberration. So with that, I'd like to go to the speech now of Congressman Benjamin Robles Montoya, who is the congressman from Mexico currently.
Montoya, the floor is yours.
Desde México hacemos un llamado a las legisladoras y
I can't hear anything,
mundo.
Jose.
We make a call from Mexico to legislators of the world to act.
Guerra nuclear. Inicio con estas palabras tan importante seminario que busca precisamente que hagamos todos los esfuerzos que estén a nuestro
In
alcance.
which we seek to use every means at our disposal to halt what could become a nuclear war. I am very pleased to greet once more Mrs. Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute.
Y a todos ustedes que participan en este tercer seminario de dirigentes políticos y sociales del mundo, para detener el peligro de una guerra nuclear. Hace menos de un mes, el 27 de octubre, se realizó el segundo seminario con nuestra participación desde la Cámara de Diputados de México. Insistimos en esa ocasión que si no se para con una solución negociada la actual crisis de Ucrania, puede derivar en una confrontación con armas nucleares entre Rusia y Estados Unidos y la OTAN. El presidente de México, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, acaba de reiterar la posición de México en este contexto el pasado 16 de noviembre. Lo hizo en la ocasión del voto reciente en la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas. Señaló, es indispensable abrir el diálogo para conseguir la paz. Que ya no se tarden porque no hay ya otra salida. México va a seguir manteniendo su postura en favor de la paz, de la solución pacífica a esa controversia, a ese enfrentamiento. Esa es la postura de México, neutralidad. Hoy, amigas y amigos, la situación estratégica es aún más peligrosa que cuando nos reunimos hace un mes. El reciente incidente en Polonia demuestra qué tan cerca hemos llegado al borde del precipicio de una guerra nuclear, ya sea por intención o por error de cálculo, y es imperativo que desde todas las naciones del planeta alcemos nuestra voz. La voz no de una nación, ni de varias naciones, sino de la humanidad entera por la paz y contra la guerra nuclear. Este compromiso y preocupación nos llevó a publicar una carta a legisladores y exlegisladores del mundo el 16 de noviembre. Es un llamado urgente, paremos el peligro de una guerra nuclear. En esa carta, la exdiputada Huerta y un servidor hicimos un llamado a nuestros colegas de todo el mundo a que se unan a este esfuerzo para impulsar que todos los
I don't know why we're not hearing the English. So we're going to, you can listen to that on the Schiller Institute site. We are going to go to Colonel Richard Black now, who has some things to say very relevant to what happened now about 10 days ago, which was the strike of missiles into Poland, killing 2 farmers, which everyone remembers. The press was very quick to blame it on Russia. Even when President Biden came out of his nap, or what, he was asleep, he was actually in Indonesia, to say that it was unlikely that Russia had done this, that Russia did not do this. The press nonetheless persisted, as did Zelensky. So let's go to Colonel Richard.
The United States and NATO are on a nuclear razor's edge. Article 5 of the
There's no
diabolical
sound.
NATO Charter says that an attack on one member is an attack on all 30 nations
Jose, can
of
we
NATO.
get the sound here?
World War III, perhaps thermonuclear war, rests today on a hair trigger. NATO comprises 950 million people with a defense budget that is 20 times Russia's. A single miscalculation can send 1 billion people off to war and precipitate a global nuclear bloodbath. On November 17th, the Washington Post carried this ominous headline: How an anonymous source raised false alarm of Russian strike on Poland. It said the Associated Press had sent a terrifying news alert around the world on Tuesday. Those are the Washington Post words. A terrifying news alert around the world on Tuesday. 2 p.m., the Associated Press wrote, a senior U.S. intelligence official says Russian missiles crossed into NATO member Poland, killing 2 people. The news agency noted that the Polish government had top leaders holding an emergency meeting due to a crisis situation. By the time that the AP took down its initial report, that report had been viewed by thousands of news outlets across the globe, and many of them published wild-eyed headlines based on the erroneous article. Because the errant missile had exploded just inside its border, Polish Foreign Minister Zbigniew Rau summoned the Russian ambassador, demanding immediate detailed explanations. Ukraine's President Zelensky hysterically accused Russia of bombarding Poland, though he must have known at that very moment that a Ukrainian missile had actually caused the blast, not a Russian one. Alone among nations, Ukraine still denies that it fired the missile and blames it on Russia. The anonymous intelligence assessment that blamed Moscow triggered immediate demands for a no-fly zone. The Ukraine Holy Grail that would embroil American jets in dogfights with Russian pilots and cause us to launch bomb strikes against Russian air defense batteries. World War III would be the almost inevitable result of a no-fly zone. The Independent reported, Biden convenes emergency G7 and NATO meeting after Russian-made rockets strike Poland. The president was awakened after midnight to news of a missile explosion, and he went on Twitter promising that and reaffirming America's ironclad commitment to NATO. Now, in the excitement and panic of the moment, the world media repeated the false Associated Press claims. Fox News cited a senior U.S. official and reports on the ground that a Russian missile had hit Poland. CNN reported that a Russian-made missile was responsible for the blast, and the Daily Mail wrote, Russian bombs killed 2 in Poland. The senior U.S. intelligence official cited by the Associated Press claimed that multiple Russian missiles had crossed into Poland. But even Poland's official statement said there was just a single missile. So why would U.S. intelligence purposefully exaggerate the facts? Why would top NATO officials be called into an emergency nighttime meeting to respond to an obvious missile malfunction, regardless of whether it came from Russia or Ukraine? Does any sentient person that Russians would choose to attack Poland with a single missile by targeting an old grain silo in a tiny farm village of 500 people? Will some event so trivial become the eventual tripwire for global nuclear conflict? This incident proves that NATO is fully primed for a 1914 moment, when the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife sparked a war that killed 18 million Europeans and led to World War II, which killed another 50 million. The next war that we face could kill billions of women and children, men, women, and children, ending civilization as we know it. Is an explosion that kills 2 farmers and destroys a grain silo worth all of that? Now, we can have peace in Ukraine and draw back from World War III whenever we choose to do so. But so far, the US and UK have repeatedly blocked peace talks to end the hostilities. Back in 2014, the Minsk peace accords were signed, ending Ukraine's war against the Donbass. However, America flooded Ukraine with a huge weapons buildup and incentivized the Ukraine's new revolutionary junta to renege on its promises and continue the bloody war against the Russian-speaking border regions that had declared independence. America blocked peace from taking hold. Again, in April 2022, just 2 months after Russia entered the war on the side of Donbass, Ukrainian President Zelensky sent a 5-page peace proposal to Russia. Russia found the proposal to be an acceptable framework for ending the fighting. President Putin backed peace talks between Russia and Ukraine, and the sides had almost arrived at a satisfactory resolution of hostilities. The Ukrainian peace negotiator, David Arakhamia, even told Ukrainian television that, and this is a quote, "The Russian Federation has given an official answer to all positions, which is that they are willing to accept the Ukrainian position, except for the issue of Crimea." But as the peace talks were proceeding smoothly, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson unexpectedly flew to Kiev and blocked them from going further. He could never have done this without White House approval. Now, at that very early stage of the war, casualties were relatively light and property damage was quite limited. Undoubtedly, 100,000 lives could have been saved if the United States had been willing to allow peace to emerge, a peace agreed to by the two parties to the war. The only reason the war continued is that the US and the UK ordered Ukraine to fight on. Now, again, just recently, on November the 9th, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, told the Economic Club of New York that a victory by Ukraine may not be achieved militarily. He said that winter could provide an opportunity to begin negotiations with Russia. However, the administration was shocked by Milley's discussion of peace, and they went into damage control, assuring Ukraine that the pause in winter fighting was no reason to discuss peace, and that Washington looks forward to supporting Ukraine's next advances and its future bloodshed on the battlefield. Once again, the U.S. has blocked peace and promoted death and destruction. In 2014, the CIA and British MI6 helped to overthrow the legitimate government of Ukraine and install a revolutionary junta. This is what began the current war in Ukraine. It wasn't started by Russia. It was started in 2014 by the CIA and British MI6. The junta, which took over, launched a campaign of hate-filled de-Russification that inspired the independence movements in the Donbass Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk, where people's language, their culture, their job security, and literally their physical safety were threatened by the revolutionary junta put in place by the United States and Great Britain by overthrowing the elected government of Ukraine in 2014. Throughout the years, Russia has patiently and consistently sought peaceful resolutions to the conflict. The US, UK, and NATO have blocked all of these peace overtures and doggedly pursued the path of war, bloodshed, and destruction. The US and NATO have violently opposed democratic self-determination for the Russian-speaking peoples of the Donbass along the border of Russia. When Elon Musk proposed UN-supervised elections to determine whether Russian-speaking regions would join Russia or return to Ukraine, Zelensky was furious. He knows that given a choice, the people of those regions would, once again, vote overwhelmingly to join Russia. Americans must come to understand that it is our government and not Russia that insist on continuing the war. We must come to grips with the mortal danger that the Ukraine war and our NATO alliances pose for the U.S. and for the world. Thank you.
Okay, so that was from Senator Colonel Richard Black, former state senator of Virginia. And you hear him saying repeatedly, but it's worth remembering, you tend to block it out, that this war could end anytime the US and the UK decide they want it to end. Anytime. It is not Russia that is prolonging the war. It is the United States and the UK. Now, for people who may not be aware of it, there was actually a press conference. As you know, we have in the new incoming Congress, there is a slim Republican majority. I wouldn't say, however, that the majority of the Republicans want to end this, but at least there are a few Republicans standing up, whereas the Democrats are uniformly supporting the war and the killing, and probably getting a rich payback from FTX or their investments in the military-industrial complex companies. The 6 congressmen who spoke saying they will not approve any more aid to Ukraine. They want a full audit. They want to know what's happening. We're led by Marjorie Taylor Greene from Georgia, but also Andrew Clyde, another representative from Georgia, Matt Gaetz, who is from Florida, Thomas Massie, Republican from Kentucky, Barry Moore, a Republican from Alabama, and Corey Mills from Florida. He is a congressman-elect. He'll be coming into the new session. So it is perhaps possible, with a lot of work on the part of the American people, that we can get off this trajectory, but we have to do it soon. And also, I think the fact that the policy could change once the new Congress is sworn in. Unfortunately, Schumer is still the majority leader of the Senate, but we could perhaps get a change, or at least slow things down, means that this period now, this lame duck session, is all the more dangerous. So with that, we are now going to hear my remarks from this conference on November 22nd.
Is America's voice in the emerging new global architecture of peace through development. Diane?
Thank you very much, Dennis. Exactly a week ago today, a missile landed in a Polish field and killed 2 farmers. While President Biden was fortunately sane enough to refrain from blaming Russia, being perhaps dimly aware of the awful implications of doing so, the immediate screaming barrage from the American press and President Zelensky, accusing Russia of having struck Poland, even after Biden stated that it was not a Russian missile, should indicate that we are perilously close to the annihilation of the human race. Even if Biden has pulled us back from Armageddon this time, his general commitment to the destruction of Russia and the suppression of China can have consequences far worse than he imagines, and which neither he nor his handlers will be able to control. In 2002, Lyndon LaRouche, in a paper entitled The Historical Individual, which is available in the latest edition of Leonora of the Schiller Institute, said or wrote, "During each tragic moment of great crisis, every nation, every culture is gripped by the need for a sudden and profound change in its quality of leadership. Its survival then depends upon its willingness to choose a new quality of leadership, which is typified by those extraordinarily exceptional individuals who stood, in retrospect, like immortal souls, apart from and above mere popular taste of their time. As in great classical tragedies portrayed on stage, in such times as this present moment, a moment of imperiled European civilization as a whole, the nation whose people abhor the exceptional individual in favor of popular opinion is already doomed to be brought down like foolish Romans drunk from their cheering for the popular mass entertainments of the Colosseum then, or foolish audiences at today's football stadium, rock concert, or video orgy. A people doomed by its own habituated, popular, inherently tragic misbelief in comfort and pleasure. If you look at who seems to be winning American elections these days, you might presume that the American people have completely lost their minds and morals, and the world is doomed. And I can't entirely rule out that possibility. However, happily or unhappily, the electoral process in the United States has been severely corrupted and is not a reflection of the thinking of the American people. This is not to say that we had large numbers of qualified leaders running for office in the midterm election. We had few, and like myself, they were considered enough of a threat to be placed on a Ukrainian kill list, blacked out of the press, and excluded from the debates. Apparently, there is a fear on the part of those who could control the electoral process in the United States that people might be susceptible of responding to qualified leadership. And so that leadership must be suppressed in all possible ways. The censorship and suppression indicates the weakness, not the strength, of those criminal elements in Western governments who are failing to convince the people of the need for war with Russia or China. It must be understood that there is no such thing as merely avoiding war. That's the problem with the anti-war left. There's no way to have peace if you believe that we must curtail energy and food consumption to save the planet. There's no way to have peace if the United States refuses to collaborate with China in eradicating poverty worldwide. There's no such thing as stasis in the universe. Everything is in motion, and particularly all things living. Human economy is no exception. Either we are progressing or we are dying. That's it. Either we are increasing the energy throughput of the system, allowing more people to live longer, more prosperous lives, or we are creating the conditions for an uncontrollable collapse where billions die of starvation and disease. On September 20th, 1963, President John F. Kennedy gave a remarkable speech to the UN General Assembly. First, he had sharp words for differences between the United States and the Soviet Union with regard to Berlin and Cuba, and the principle of self-determination of people. And he even said, our defense around the world will be maintained for the protection of freedom. But he went on, but I would say to the leaders of the Soviet Union and to their people that if either of our countries is to be fully secure, we need a much better weapon than the H-bomb. A weapon better than ballistic missiles or nuclear submarines. And that better weapon is peaceful cooperation. We have, in recent years, agreed on a limited test ban treaty, on an emergency communications link between our capitals, on a statement of principles for disarmament, on an increase in cultural exchange, on cooperation in outer space, on the peaceful exploration of the Antarctic, and on tempering last year's crisis over Cuba. I believe, therefore, that the Soviet Union and the United States, together with their allies, can achieve further agreements which spring from our mutual interest in avoiding mutual destruction. Finally, in a field where the United States and the Soviet Union have a special capacity, in the field of space, there is room for new cooperation, for further joint efforts in the regulation and exploration of space. I include among these possibilities a joint expedition to the moon. Space offers no problems of sovereignty. By resolution of this assembly, the members of the United Nations have forsworn any claim to territorial rights in outer space or on celestial bodies, and declared that international law and the United Nations Charter will apply. Why, therefore, should man's first flight to the moon be a matter of national competition? Why should the United States and the Soviet Union, in preparing for such expeditions, become involved in immense duplications of research, construction, and expenditure? Surely, we should explore whether the scientists and astronauts of our two countries, indeed of all the world, cannot work together in the conquest of space, sending someday in this decade to the moon not the representatives of a single nation, but the representatives of all of our countries. All these and other new steps toward peaceful cooperation may be possible. Most of them will require on our part full consultation with our allies, for their interests are as much involved as our own, and we will not make an agreement at their expense. Most of them will require long and careful negotiation, and most of them will require a new approach to the Cold War, a desire not to bury one's adversary, but to compete in a host of peaceful arenas, in ideas, in production, and ultimately in service to all mankind. How many Americans are aware that President Kennedy had proposed that the moon landing be a joint effort with the Soviet Union, and that he proposed this in the middle of the Cold War, less than 1 year after the Cuban Missile Crisis? Our nation has gone horribly awry. It began after the death of FDR, just before VE Day, eliminating his ability to shape the post-war world. When the American people complied with the Warren Commission cover-up of the assassination of Kennedy, we gave up a commitment to the principles expressed in that speech. And when we failed to get to the truth about rogue elements from within the United States, which perpetrated the 9/11 attack on our nation, but went around the world killing and displacing millions of poor people in poor countries, rather than face the terrifying truth, we surrendered to those treasonous elements within our own government. As a result, we are now on the brink of Armageddon if we don't change our ways. That fact is becoming known to a growing number of people in the United States, and it helps that billions of people around the world live in nations whose leaders recognize that the United States no longer has the moral authority or economic strength to impose its arbitrary rules upon the world. However, that's not enough to ensure that we will avoid a catastrophic end. I don't think we should count on the restraint of President Joe Biden to prevent us from falling over the cliff, but we must build a robust movement in the United States, in the streets, and in the town hall meetings of the congressmen, which not only forces an end to the proxy war against Russia, but which elevates the American people to consider what a newly sworn-in President Kennedy asked of us, that we consider what we can do for mankind. Thank you. So that was my comment at this conference, and I really would urge people to go to the Schiller Institute website and catch up everything. We had some extreme technological challenges that day. Who knows the cause? I'm sure, as I know from my own situation, that there are definitely those who wish to silence these ideas. Now, I just want to say in response to some of the comments coming in from Facebook about the global South or this or that, I know that in the West, we are really accustomed to think in terms of enemies and friends, zero-sum game. If another nation is prosperous, then we're doing worse. That is really not how the universe works, and that is really not the American system. Henry Carey, one of the economic advisors to Abraham Lincoln, wrote a book called Harmony of Interest, where he actually proved that protective tariffs on American industry not only protected the United States, but they actually helped to contribute to raising the standard of living around the world, because we don't have to compete for who can grind up their workforce the most quickly, but also you can compete to see what a workforce with decent health care, a decent work schedule, no child labor, certain reasonable environmental regulations, not phony stuff about CO2, but obviously not dumping of chemicals in your water and toxic landfill and so on, that a commitment to these principles actually can serve to raise the standard of living around the world. And in fact, it was the case when you had certain protective tariffs in the United States protecting the jobs of American workers. If we wanted to import silk from China and pay a tax on it, you had the resources to do it. So actually, the protectionism increased the trade, whereas the so-called free trade decrease the trade because everyone got to become poor. Now, what China has been doing where it works is based on certain universal principles which were expressed in the American system. There's a reason why Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz found Confucianism to be so compatible with Christianity. That's what Helga Zepp-LaRouche was working on. And I would urge people to consider the fact that you've seen in the Webb telescope that there are literally trillions of galaxies. That means billions, trillions, even orders of trillions of planets, which could possibly be habitable by humans or by perhaps other intelligent life forms. We don't know. In that picture, our Earth is very tiny. There's a reason why astronauts or space travelers, when they orbit the Earth from a distance for the first time, have a very profound emotional experience, because they realize, in fact, you can see it from outer space, that we really are in the same boat. That doesn't mean we have to be identical. It doesn't mean we have to have a one world government or all speak the same language or have the same religion. It means that there must be a way that our differences can contribute to a greater good. Just as if you look at the work of a great composer like Beethoven in his Missa Solemnis, which I happened to look at maybe a year and a half ago on this principle, I discovered that there are in many places more than 37 different voices participating at the same time, but each voice has its own unique part. But when you put them together, you get something which is infinitely greater than the sum of the parts. That has to be the relationship among humankind. We don't know where the next genius is going to be born. We don't know if it's Somalia, Guyana, Indonesia, or in the Bronx. That's why it's so important that the government, why it says in our Declaration of Independence that there are certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Life because that's the prerequisite of developing your God-given talents, and that's why you have liberty. Liberty is not license. Liberty is that you don't do things by force, but you enable yourself to do the good by an act of your own volition, by free will. So there's much more we can discuss in that regard, but we really are going to have to make a renaissance in our nation to collaborate with the rest of the world, which is moving in a much more positive direction. Everyone should be on their guard through this holiday season, knowing that we do have a new Congress coming in, knowing that there seems to be some signs of resistance. We have to back that up. Again, as I said, unfortunately, Schumer, and I'm happy to say I did not help him to keep his position as the Senate Majority Leader, but that's where he is. So the Senate is going to be tough, but that doesn't mean the American people don't have the power to change this. And I would urge you to look at the conference as a whole, because what you will see is the whole world is wondering what is going on over here. They know that people are experiencing hyperinflation, but what it looks like from the outside is that people didn't vote overwhelmingly against Biden. So how can that be? They're wondering, do the American people know and approve of what our government is doing? So we have to make sure that we change what our government is doing, which I think is very much possible. So I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in this evening. I'm sorry for our own technical difficulties, but I think you got a gist of the conference. Please go to the Schiller Institute website and watch it, and I will see you again here next week.